Aloha! I am Dr. Melissa Yee from the group Seeds of Truth, and we are here in Waiahole Valley in this beautiful setting together with Dr. Ignacio Chapela. And we are so fortunate to have him visiting here in Hawaii. So we would like to share a few words with him and get some of his expertise so that we can share that with other people here in Hawaii. Welcome, Dr. Chapela.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes.
Thank you for this interview.
Well, we're very happy to have you here because I know you have many years of experience with the biotechnology field. And I just wanted to have people understand a little bit about your background and why you're here and what you're seeing as the possibilities for the future with regards to science and biotechnology.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke recently at an event here in Honolulu, and it seemed to me that the response was very positive. But I'd just like to hear from you what actually brought you to become a scientist. What was your inspiration? Because you are originally from Mexico?
That's right. That's right. I was born in Mexico. I'm a city boy. Mexico City, at that time, probably the largest city in the world. And yet, I always had this drive to get out of it. Mexico City is in this ball, it's sitting inside a ball surrounded by mountains. And I always had the drive to walk out, bike out, get out in some way. For some reason that is, I don't know, other non-human nature calls. I've always been called to try and understand and interact with the non-human world. From a very early age, I'm that kind of lucky person who gets that message from an early age. So by the time I was 15 or so, I was very, very clear that I wanted to dedicate my life to understanding, to trying to open my eyes and open my understanding to how is it that non-humans interact with each other, how is it that they operate, and how is it that they relate to us. And, I'm now old in some ways, and I've been in many different countries, I've lived in different countries, always pursuing this question. I trained as a biologist. It was a time when biology was taught in the 19th century style, in which the goal was really to get the student, the young person, to be exposed and knowledgeable about every form of life that we knew about. So we spent many, many semesters studying the worms of the sea and the little creatures with strange shapes and funny life stories and so on. And it gets you into this place where you realize the world is so big and so different from anything that our purely human culture tells us. So it opens this little window into a world that is incredibly magic, incredibly beautiful, complex, not complicated, but complex. And then it brings this desire, at least it brought in me, the desire to try and understand. And try and understand communication was my question. How we communicate, how they communicate with each other. And at that point, by that time I was in university, and I discovered fungi, the microscopic world. And fungi are really good because they also work like a window, because a big mushroom, it's big, you can see it, you can grab it in your hand, cook it, eat it, have some pleasure from it. But then when you dig under and try to find out where it comes from, you find nothing. Until you discover that it is actually a microbe that is all under our feet and everywhere. So I became so passionate about fungi for so many years. And I would do anything. I had no money, but I would just go anywhere where I could get some wisdom from someone who knew about fungi. And that's how I got to get my PhD. I did my PhD in the University of Wales in Cardiff.
Yes.
Working with fungi of forests. That gives you opportunities to interact with people who are interested in disease questions, diseases of trees, diseases of agricultural crops and so on. So I was a pathologist for a while, a plant pathologist. I still teach today plant pathology students, but I don't consider myself a plant pathologist anymore. After that, I spent the next maybe 20 years as a pure researcher. My humanity colleagues in university always said, how come you're getting white hair and you haven't taught yet? How dare you? You get only the pleasure of research and no teaching. And I wasn't really ready for teaching at that point. And so I was happy to have all these opportunities to do research, following fungi, trying to understand. So I studied fungi in their relationship with ants, in their relationship with trees and other plants. I studied fungi in all kinds of situations until I got older. And I started realizing, now I think I do have something to give to young people.
Right.
And I started feeling the drive to teach.
Yes.
And at that point, I don't know how the stars align in our lives sometimes, right?
Yes.
And at that point, this job came up at the University of California in Berkeley to take up a new position. And they asked me, what do you want this position to be called? And I said, biologist, please. I want to be a biologist when I grow up. And they said, no, biology is not a subject that a self-respecting university of the late 20th century should take.
Yeah.
That's from the 19th century.
Yes.
We must be something specialized and something, you know. So they gave me the title of microbial ecologist, which suits me fine, because as you know, microbes form 98% of life forms on the planet. The world is really run by microbes. We are made of microbes. Everything really is microbes. So the world that we see, the world that we can hug and we can kiss, is beautiful, it's powerful, it's what matters to us, but it's only a very small part.
Right.
And ecology, which talks about the relationship between life forms, basically means everything, biology. So being a microbial ecologist for me is the closest I can get to being called a biologist. But for me, really, the question is, do we understand biology? Because understanding biology is understanding life.
Yes.
And it's life that we share as humans. So it connects with health, it connects with nutrition, it connects with all these things that we care about because our bodies are part of life.
Right.
But it's much larger than that. Biology is about that in connection with the health and the nutrition and the connectivity and the communication of places like this that are complex and beautiful.
Yes. Sometimes we forget living in the city that there are beautiful, tranquil places like this. And it's so important to get out into the nature, which I think many city dwellers forget to take the time to do. With regards to your time at UC Berkeley, how many years have you been there now? And what are you doing now as research or teaching?
I've been there for 22 years now. And it's a research university, so most of my evaluations come from research, but we of course also teach. I teach more than most of my colleagues. And I teach in my field. I teach microbiology, I teach forest pathology, soil biology, soil microbiology, but I also teach biology, or at least I find titles for my courses. For example, environmental biology is acceptable.
Okay.
And in those courses, I try to expose young people to, you know, what I have discovered after so many years of pursuing these questions. I've worked for the industry too. In the 80s, I used to work for what was the pharmaceutical and agrochemical industry. They used to call themselves the life sciences industry. This is just before the biotechnology revolution, if you will, started in 1982, 83, something like that. I was at that point within the industry. So I really got to see the birth of that industry.
Yes.
And ever since, I've been really embedded and moving in the development of that industry that is now the genetic engineering industry, or whatever you want to call it. So I've always been engaged with that discussion, and that has become a very important part of my teaching and my research at Berkeley. Just to say, my lab is dedicated to the development of detection methods that will allow farmers in remote places where there is no electricity, where there is no money, there is no training, there is no equipment, to detect the presence of GMOs, for example, but also detect the presence of pathogens, whatever they want to look for. We're developing methods for that to happen.
So in the beginning, in the time of 1982, there was a lot of promise of what GMOs or biotechnology could bring to agriculture and to food production. And what was your initial impression of what it was going to do for science, for people, for food? Were you open to it, and did you feel that there was a lot of potential there?
Yes, I was a lot more positive about it when I was young. I think it is a little bit part of being an adolescent or a child to be hopeful like that, and to want to believe that we have solutions to all problems, and that we can come up with solutions that are quick. I was very aware, even when I was within industry, and especially because I was working for industry, of the many very powerful and very terrible forces that were coming onto this development. You know, the forces of privatization, the forces of this massive globalization in which you cannot be delicate enough about a place, a location, a group of people, their traditions or how they work. I was very aware of that, and so I was not at all positive about these developments because of who was behind it, because of the people I was working for, because I knew we really did not have any bounds to how far we would go to just do things our way.
Yeah, because it was a whole new field. We had never gone there before, so there was enormous possibility, but at the same time risk, because we didn't know how it would end.
It was enormous possibility in theory.
Yes.
But already in the hands of the wrong people. That I was very clear about. And in fact, it was part of the reason why I decided to move out. Because I could see that this was going really the wrong way, and I did not want to be part of it. I moved out and I started learning by applying what I had learned within the industry. At that point, the whole question of what is called genetic resources and who owns those genetic resources, right? From the industry point of view, we could send someone off to Hawaii, take a soil sample, nobody would be the wiser, even have it in your shoe. Bring it back to Switzerland, you pull out all these microbes, there are thousands and thousands of species of microbes out of that shoe sample if you want, and then maybe one of them will be the producer of a massive new drug. For example, where I worked, Sandoz, in Switzerland, LSD was discovered, but also cyclosporine, which is what allowed the development of the transplantation industry altogether. There was no transplantation industry before cyclosporine, and cyclosporin comes from a fungus that was found in the soil in Norway. Now, Sandoz brought in billions of dollars from that, and the Norwegians saw nothing. How do you square that with human rights, with the rights of sovereign nations, with international law, with national laws and so on? That was a very serious problem that I dedicated several years after I left industry to address. So I was working from Cornel University, but I was working a lot on the policy of these questions, trying to help people think about how is it that indigenous communities especially, all over the world, are really the people who have stewarded all these things for centuries and millennia, and yet we are making money out of it, giving nothing back.
Right.
And in fact, using that very money to go and destroy their very communities, right? I tried. I was part of that a lot. I
Yeah.
also gave up on that in some ways because the battles there were too difficult, I guess, for me.
Were you doing that on an individual basis, or were you working with groups or organizations, or was there a movement happening already then?
I'm just so incredibly lucky. I live month by month, check to check. And that's the way I've lived since I was 16, 15. And yet somehow I've always found an opportunity to work on what I think is important for me. And at that point, these questions were very important to me. And I wrote to this guy at Cornel, Tom Aisner, who I had read about, who was asking these questions. And I said, I'm coming out of industry. I think I have something to say about it. And he found money and he hired me, and
Excellent.
I went. So I was working within the institution, within Cornell University.
Yeah.
And ever since, I've always found a way to get myself funded in some way. Now I have this tenure job at Berkeley, where I have the incredible privilege to pursue questions that are important to me, because I feel are important for the public, and be paid for it.
Yeah, but people they came to know you because of the issue with the Mexican corn.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind sharing a little bit about that? That it was, it really gets to the heart of what you stand for and what you believe in. That something indigenous could be patented, could be contaminated, could be taken advantage of.
Yes.
at the cost of a population.
Yes. So I'm really thankful that you give me all this time to talk about myself.
Yeah, certainly.
But I think it is useful because now you would understand why I got into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was not ignorant. Many times people get into trouble in science for finding the wrong thing without knowing.
Yes.
And then they just have to face a difficult situation without knowing. I knew too much. I knew what was going on. I was part of it. And yet at that point, I was working with a coalition of indigenous communities in the southern state of Oaxaca in Mexico.
Yeah.
And I was part of their reflection on these questions. I was their source of information, telling them, look, this is what's happening. This is what's happening inside industry. This is what's happening outside. This is what's happening in Washington, D.C., in United Nations, because I had worked for United Nations for a while. This is how they're thinking. And you guys are what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And without them even knowing, right?
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time there, being in assemblies, talking to the elders, talking to people and so on, in their process for about 15 years. Part of that process started to include the question of GMOs, of transgenics.
Yes.
Because by 1996, the US decided now we're going to make it legal to plant commercially open field GMO varieties, right? As a biologist, you realize you introduce something into an environment, something that reproduces. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take very much knowledge to know that something is going to move around and spread.
Right.
It wants to spread,
Yes.
right? So as a biologist, and because of the knowledge that I had before, I knew that it was not a question of if, it was a question of when.
Right.
They would find their landrace varieties, their precious and incredibly valuable landrace varieties of corn, contaminated with genetically modified corn. So we were talking about this over the years as part of the many subjects that we were developing. They said, well, that sounds really strange. It's hard to believe. You tell us that people are talking about moving genetic material from a fish into a corn plant. Mm-hmm. I said, yeah. Well, that sounds weird. I said, yeah, it is very weird. Mm-hmm. But I'm just telling you
They're capable of doing that.
That's what's coming.
Yes.
And they said, okay, so how are we going to see it? Is it going to be corn with the face of a fish or something? And I said, no, it's going to look the same. Mm-hmm. And who is going to help us, or who's going to tell us when it's coming here? Are we going to hear about it when it's going to be released here? No, you probably won't. And can we tell? No, you probably won't be able to tell either.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they decided to build up the technical capacity to detect
Mm-hmm.
the presence of GMO.
Mm-hmm.
And the surprise came when the first day that we looked for them, it was a workshop that my student was running. I was in Berkeley, he was down in Oaxaca. And he was running a workshop to teach the technicians, because these people had already established their own labs, brought up their own people through university, and they had real commitment to this. So my student, my PhD student, was teaching a workshop. And in the workshop, he had to introduce some negative controls.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought negative control is going to be a local variety of corn, because that's the place where the cleanest corn exists.
Mm-hmm.
And the surprise came because those negative controls came up positive.
Yeah.
We could have shut up, we could have said, oh, that was a mistake, we could have run away or turned the other way, but because of my background, because of where I was, it was something that I couldn't possibly look away from. And so we ended up publishing this.
Mm-hmm.
We managed to publish it in Nature, which was in itself a big political campaign to get it in the pages of Nature that is read all around the world. And it became very big news, because it really was a demonstration that what the industry had been saying for a long time, what was the justification for the release of GMOs, was false.
Yes.
That they always said, we know what we're doing, we can control it, it's not going to get out of control, and so on and so forth. Finding this contamination in the state of Oaxaca, thousands of miles from the nearest legal GMO plant, was enough proof to say the whole thing is founded on foundations of mud.
Yes. This is tragic for the world, isn't it? Because we're seeing this contamination all over the world now, and we have been so trusting and believing in science that it would solve all the problems of starvation and lack of food and lack of quality of food. And then we find out the nightmare has already been released into nature.
Yeah, the reality is that back then, in the 80s and early 90s, the promises were great, the risks were great.
Yeah.
So it was a question of risk versus potential benefit.
Right.
And some people were saying, well, the benefit is great.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to solve hunger, and we're going to defeat death and defeat disease. Some people like that. So the potential benefits are great. Let's run into the risk and then solve the problems when we get there.
Yeah.
Now, we are 30, 40 years down the line. What we have is real damage, real harm that has already happened,
Yeah.
against promises that never came.
Yes.
So the promises of solving hunger, of producing something more nutritious or anything else, really have not been fulfilled. And the dangers and the risks that we were talking about back in the 80s have become true.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that for a long time.
Yeah,
obviously.
I know. But the tragic thing is that we've seen the same thing happening here in Hawaii. Because I remember back in about 1990s, early 1990s, when we were told by our then governor that he would be bringing in many different companies to assist in research for a better use of the lands which had laid fallow for so long from the sugarcane and pineapple production, that here was a new agriculture, a new possibility to earn money, to provide jobs, and also make Hawaii a research laboratory for the world. And we went along with that because it sounded so promising. But now, 30 years later, we realize it didn't turn out at all like that. And we're having to clean up the mess, which was already there because of the pineapple and sugar pollution with all the chemicals that they were using at that time. So it's been compounded now.
Yes, I think the situation in Hawaii is really tragic. I mean, I find it really difficult to be in Hawaii, I must say. Very, very difficult, because my heart just aches.
Yes.
with every time you look anywhere, you see invasive species, you see pollution, you see abuse of the land, abuse of the sea. It's tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy, abuse upon abuse. I'm sorry to say it that way, but I think it is the only way that can be said. And the GMO contamination and invasion, if you want, simply builds up on that history of tragedy. And what you say your governor told you, that Hawaii could become a laboratory for the world, sounds very pretty. But there's another way of saying that, and that is that Hawaii can be a sacrificial island for the world.
Right. And I think very possibly that was taken into consideration when they decided to move here. It being such an isolated landmass that if there was an accident, then it would be contained within this area, not thinking of the consequences to the people who lived here, to the oceans, to the land, to the mountains.
Exactly. As an outsider, it's really difficult not to see that the land, the mountains, the sea, and the people are more or less considered disposable.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
just
very
commodities,
offensive.
Yes.
And they're compared as if they were commodities that could be traded. Well, how much is a Hawaiian or 100 Hawaiians compared to 100 Californians?
Right.
And it's very hard as a Californian now to not to see that in this horrible, perverse way of thinking, the evaluation of a Hawaiian life, and especially livelihood, not a human individual life, but the livelihood that connects that human life to the land and to the sea, makes, it's a perverse equation that makes that less valuable than a single life living in a high rise in Honolulu or San Francisco.
Yeah, I think you've been here a week and seen so many different places and talked to many people, including indigenous people, and you've come to understand in a very short time, because you are so perceptive and coming from your heart, you can just feel the frustration that we have, that we must continue to live in this. And you can walk away from it, you're going to return home soon, but you will see the devastation continuing and continuing, and we cannot leave it.
I know, that's why I say it's really hard for me to come here.
Yeah.
I don't enjoy it in that way, you know. These beautiful sunsets and beautiful waters are very pretty.
Yes.
But they cannot allay the terrible tragedies that.
Yeah.
And there is beauty behind it too. I've also seen the beauty of resistance, the beauty of resilience of people who just refuse to go away. Like you say, I go away. You know, I'm an errant soul. In a way, I have no home, really. I'm a nomadic kind of person. But I know the power and the value of being rooted in a place and standing up for it.
Yeah.
And I have seen enough of that here in Hawaii to actually have hope that is not silly, hollow, postcard kind of hope, but it's much more a hope that comes from knowing that things have to change and seeing that there are people here who will pick up when that moment comes. And probably it's happening already.
Yeah, it is. If you were to compare what has happened in Mexico with the indigenous corn and the coming together of the people there and seeing how people are reacting here, what are some of the suggestions you would offer to us to be able to be more effective in our resistance against continual commercialization and exploitation of the land?
Yeah, that's a very important question and very deep, and I'm sure, you know, a conversation of 3 hours wouldn't be enough. I think it would be a very good topic of conversation, of comparing.
Yeah.
Because there are many things that are common to the two places.
Right.
And I would take the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, because it's a state where indigenous rights have been maintained. Human habitation there has continuously existed for 10,000 years at least. since the domestication of corn. And the same people are continuously existing there with their governance forms of dealing with the land and so on and so forth to this day. Even though there is a nation state, the Mexican state, that has come in a way like the United States has come here to declare this is my nation state, right? 19th century kind of politics. One big difference that I notice is that in Mexico, corn really is identifiable with the people one-to-one. It's not corn is not a banner to rally behind. It's what people are made of. And people who are really from there are made of corn, and corn is made of people. And this is something that is a very basic concept that is hard for anyone outside to understand, but it's very real. And that makes any abuse, any intrusion into the world of corn, not just the plant, but the way corn is grown, the soil that holds corn together, the landscapes, the watersheds, and so on. Any abuse of that becomes an affront to every individual and to any organization and any larger group, to the point where even federal level senators and Congress people really don't dare to be seen maligning corn or saying something. They always have ways of getting their way and so on, but you cannot talk bad about corn in Mexico. I don't know, because I don't have enough experience here in Hawaii, but I think that connection to maybe taro,
yes,
or maybe the agriculture and water culture that connects taro to the sea and to the mountains has been broken. That's my impression. And the more high-rises rise in Honolulu or around the island or around the islands, the different islands, the more young people do not get to understand that. And that kind of understanding really has to come from a very early age to get it, that the affront on the land is an affront on you, on your family, on your relatives, because that's the kind of energy that brings people out to say, no, you're just not going to do this.
Yeah. As an outsider, being of Chinese descent, and I was born here and grew up here and feel that Hawaii is very much a part of my home, that I am a part of this place. And yet, this sovereignty movement is just beginning to take hold in the consciousness of the Hawaiian people, because they have too long been passive in allowing these abuses to continue. And so we will probably see in the next generation of Hawaiians and part Hawaiians who take on this responsibility from their core, and not only do it as a matter of protest. So we have a ways to go.
I have a question for you. To what extent do you think what Monsanto and DuPont are doing is a form of bribing?
It is.
The ignorance of this deep connection. And in a way, I think any resistance to this will have to deal with that, because it's a powerful bribe. I mean, you said it before, jobs and money and maybe fame or something in the world. And I would extend that, I'm afraid, to the military.
Yeah.
The military who will be able to bribe, meaning, what do you want? Do you want high rises? Do you want a train? We'll build a train. Do you want a new road? As long as you allow all this to continue. So I can see that being a very difficult hurdle to go over.
I think with what's happening on the volcano in Hawaii Island, that we're observing how nature is reclaiming its own. And unfortunately, there's going to have to be more destruction and more self-reflection before we take active action to change the way we've been going. The temptation is always to go along with what's already been planned for us by councils, city councils, city planners. But to see what's happening on the Big Island is a big wake-up call for many people. But can we do it in time? That's always the question.
There's always time, right?
Yeah.
It's always too late. You could say that it's always too late. It is already too late when I see all this bamboo growing here and all these invasive diseases and all, the mongoose and I don't know what. You could say
Right.
it's too late.
Yeah.
Give up. But it's never too late.
Yeah, I don't see that. But I think a lot of the people still feel that it's left to the younger people to do it. But with this growing consciousness among all the people who live here, of the forces of nature being really sovereign beyond whoever is ruling the land, that's when you really stand back in awe and respect and say, it's going to go the way it's going to go no matter what we try to do. So, you've had a very short time here, but you've already got an essence of what this place is about, not only the beauty and the care that is in the land, but also the abuse of it. And so if we were to talk about something a little bit different, like the future of agriculture and biotechnology, where do you think we're going?
Well, agricultural biotechnology is a non-starter. It's hard to see it in Hawaii because you have the influence is so great here. But one of the reasons why the pressure is so great here is because there is so much resistance on the continent.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the US, which is the most promotional country in the world. But then you take your scope a little bit further out and you realize, well, the US, Brazil, Argentina, a little bit of Australia, South Africa, about 5 countries are the countries that grow GMOs
Mm-hmm.
and that are really into the biotechnology in agriculture kind of thing. You look at what products they have, like what they call products, they call plants products, which I think is really offensive,
Mm-hmm.
but that's what they say. They have 2. They developed them in the 70s, and they still haven't come up with anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they come up with stories and with promises again and again and again. For 40 years, they've been having promises, but the reality is that those 5 countries, 98% of the land is planted to 2 things: herbicide-resistant plants and insecticide-producing plants. 2 products, 5 countries, 5 crops, right? Corn, canola, cotton, what else? Soybeans.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So those are the 4 big ones. And of course you have little specialty things and so on, but the bulk of it continues to be those very few commodities. So you ask yourself, why after 40 years of development do we not have anything else? And
Mm-hmm.
the answer is because they don't really know what they're doing and it's not going anywhere. So what does the future hold for agricultural biotechnology? In 1999, the Deutsche Bank said nothing. The Deutsche Bank put up a report for investors: if you are invested in agricultural biotechnology, get out, because it's not going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
1999, that's when all these companies tried to change their names,
Mm-hmm.
Monsanto, Syngenta, and so on. You look at any serious analysis of agricultural biotechnology today and you see there is no benefit, there's no added value to a crop to going biotech. On the contrary,
Mm-hmm.
you have to sell at an underprice compared to organic, compared to GMO free. So if you ask me where is agriculture going, it has to go away from GMOs.
Mm-hmm.
It has to go away from biotechnology. And that to me would be a really interesting thing to see developing here in Hawaii, because again, the isolation of the islands would make it an ideal place to actually grow very specific and valuable non-GM,
Mm-hmm.
Different things, not only corn, not only soybean, but all kinds of other things for the world, but especially for here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is a renaissance that is already underway
Mm-hmm.
of diversified, site-appropriate, human-driven, as opposed to technology and
Yeah.
machine-driven, human-driven agriculture that has to come because the agriculture that we've been pursuing for the last 100 years, if that, 70 years or so, since the Green Revolution, really is not getting us anywhere good.
Mm-hmm.
It's really causing more problems than solutions. So I think the answer is pretty simple and clear. How we get there is the question, because that's what our lifetimes are going to be like, right?
Yeah.
Before I die, I want to see this happening. And I think that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, and I think you're being a part of that that movement in that direction, because you've made people aware of how tragic and how harmful this technology has been, and that there has to be another way. But as far as you getting down and, you know, digging up the soil and changing it to become more organic and more vital with those microorganisms that you've been talking about from the very beginning, it's going to take time, and yet the consciousness has to go there. And so maybe that's coming with this new generation of small farmers.
Yeah, but small farmers with the right knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, what I think is very, very important is to really maintain this kind of landscape, this kind of initiative. That means people living in the land, learning from the land, and keeping that knowledge that they have derived from the land together so that they can pass it on to the future generations.
Yes.
Because you're right, there is no one system that is going to work all over the world. Every corner of the world will have to go back to the place where we used to deal with each corner of the world differently.
Yeah.
And that you can only do by living there and passing that knowledge down. So a place like this farm that we're sitting in is really where the future is.
Mm-hmm.
Small as it might be today, I don't see how else we can come across into the future.
Yeah. I really thank you for taking your time to be here today. Our conversation will continue, and mahalo for all your work.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.